I just want to add a word of thanks to what Tom already said. I am so honored to be here with people about whom I heard, like John Shattuck, Istvan Rev, whose work I followed, Chapa, a dear friend, all of you, and to present this result of more than 10 years of work. And it's very special for me also on a personal level, because Budapest, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, is also the city where I was born. And for me to present my first book here has a special meaning. And this work on this book was enormous fun. It was investigative work. It was also work that took me to meet the most interesting people of the era. This work gave me, thanks to the National Security Archive, this work gave me access to people with whom I would never otherwise have met, like Anatoly Chernyaev, Gorbachev himself, all their advisors. I had access to their archive pretty much fully in the last 10 years. And I could tell stories and stories and stories and stories about how we really tried to keep everything open and how we tried to keep access on the Russian side open. But since we're limited with time and I would rather hear your questions, I just want to walk you through some major revelations that I think came from the Soviet side. And Istvan pointed out that he looked at this book and he sees a different Gorbachev. Gorbachev then himself did not see this vision from the beginning. Gorbachev who learned, and there is one Gorbachev in 1985, and a completely, well not completely, but a different person, a committed social democrat by 1991. And also something else that Istvan said, he said one of our missions is to make the archive relevant. Well, this book and our work in the Russian archives is very relevant because especially in the last year there has been tremendous fight over the reinterpretation of history. In Russia we now even have a commission against falsification of history. So there is a new narrative being written, and in that narrative very often it's the American conspiracy that undermined the Soviet Union, that undermined the Warsaw Pact, and there is this naive Gorbachev who was just kind of charmed by Western leaders and gave away the store. And our book, I think, shows a completely different process. Our book shows a real vision and ideas that led to this outcome, which was very far from predetermined. Tom mentioned the contingency of history, and this is the feeling that I had reading every document, thinking, oh my God, but it could have been completely different, completely different. There are so many little forks in the road, and if they took another turn, wrong or right, but another turn, we would have been in a completely different world. So let me just go very quickly over what's happening and what's new. Tom began with the day when the Berlin Wall collapsed. And a lot of people say, well, why didn't the Soviet Union react? Were they thinking about it? What were they doing? What were they thinking? On November 9, 1989, there is a Politburo, and we have the full text of that Politburo. And the word Germany is not even mentioned, because by the fall 1989, they had different concerns. They have strikes all over the countries. They have the Baltic republics who want to succeed. And so the Prime Minister says, we should not be thinking now, it's too late to think about the Baltics. We should be thinking about Russia and Ukraine, who might be seceding from the Soviet Union. He says, I smell an overall collapse. Quite a Cassandra. About the same time, Chernyaev writes in his diary, main advisor to Gorbachev, he says, the total dismantling of socialism as a world phenomenon has been taking place. And then very unexpectedly, perhaps it is inevitable and good, for this is a reunification of mankind on the basis of common sense. I thought it's a great analysis at that moment in 1989. But we found, looking at these documents, and not just those in the book, but with the ones we published on the website, that the change began very early. It's not that they suddenly were confronted with events in Eastern Europe in 1989. The change begins practically when Gorbachev comes to power. He comes to power, he looks, and you can see it in the earliest meetings, he says, we really have to reform the Warsaw Pact. It's not working. Cooperation is not genuine. There is no integration. They just rely on our raw materials and we want some consumer goods from them. But they would rather trade with the West. We have to change it. We have to change our policy of Big Brother. It has to be collaborative. We have to respect them. These are the first words. So his vision is we create real integration within the Warsaw Pact. And then when we achieve this real integration, and the Blinken actually suggests we should do it like they do in NATO. They actually consult each other. Oh, good idea. But so they think, okay, we integrate within the Warsaw Pact. And then as a unit, then we integrate with Europe. And it will be this integration between the equals. Very quickly, however, what happens on the Soviet side is the reassessment of the value of Eastern Europe. And it happens based on two factors. The first one, the initial one, and probably the most important one, is that as a result of interaction with American primarily leaders, also with Margaret Thatcher, but Reagan was the key agent in this change, Gorbachev suddenly realizes that the United States is not threatening the Soviet Union. It's not going to attack the Soviet Union. It's not interested in arms race in space. He actually gets it that Reagan wants nuclear abolition, and that's what Gorbachev wants, because that significant reduction of armaments and nuclear abolition would solve all his problems and the Cold War, and therefore allow all these resources to go to domestic reform so he can rebuild the socialism that he wanted, the socialism with the human face, in the Soviet Union. Now, if there is no threat from the West, then the strategic value of Eastern Europe as a territory in a future European conflict goes to zero. That's one element of the reassessment. And the second element of reassessment is economic. When the price of oil drops by the factor of 4 from 154 rubles per ton to a little more than 40 rubles per ton, they understand they cannot afford Eastern Europe any longer. And suddenly, within a matter of 3 years, really, by early 1988, they speak about Eastern Europe as a burden, and Gorbachev himself, on March 10, 1988, says, in the economic sense, speaking about Eastern Europe, socialism has not passed the test of practice. We're not offering ourselves as a model for Eastern Europe anymore. In fact, we want to encourage them to integrate on the basis of Western model, because this is our future too. Well, this is a revelation, but it was not the initial position. They came to it slowly, and these documents show this gradual process of change in perception, in assessment, and then the conclusions. I think also what's very valuable about the book is that we include not just the voices of the top leadership like Gorbachev or Bush or East European leaders, but the voices of Gorbachev's advisors, who were, most of his closest advisors were more liberal and more progressive than he was. Georgy Shakhnazarov was one of them, probably the most visionary and radical thinker. Before Gorbachev goes to Prague in April 1987, Shakhnazarov prepares a memorandum for him as a basis for the future Politburo decision. And he says, Mikhail Sergeyevich, we have to withdraw troops from Czechoslovakia. We really have to do it. Now, you have to announce it in April when you go to Prague. And Gorbachev fails to make this choice. His closest friend from Moscow State University, Mlinar Zdenek, writes about it a very interesting analysis about Gorbachev in Prague and why Gorbachev did not change the interpretation of 68. He said, Gorbachev himself was a hostage to the Brezhnev doctrine, and what constrained him, in great expression, is the dead body of Prague Spring lying in the mausoleum. So he was not able, it was a huge missed opportunity. Imagine what would have happened if Gorbachev said, there, we're withdrawing the troops, we're changing interpretation of 1968. He didn't. The third major revelation, I would say, and this is responding, it's my direct response to Jacques Lévesque's title of the book, The Enigma of 1989. What's the enigma? Why didn't the Soviet Union use force? And looking at all these documents that we have now, I would say it's the logic of 1989. You look at everything, the most illogical, the most undermining of his own policy decision would have been to use force. And we looked at everything available, and I have to say I read every single Politburo session between 1985 and the end of 1990, and some in 91. Not once, not even hardliners, nobody ever raises the question and says, well, let's put some pressure on them. We can't allow that to happen. Look what's happening in Poland, even after the election in Poland. Let's punish those Poles. Ceausescu and Honecker suggest that idea, but the Soviets say no. Very early on, in 1986, June 1986, Gorbachev presents a personal memorandum to the Central Committee. It's quite an unusual, it's a rare document when the General Secretary writes a personal memorandum. It's a statement of policy. In that memorandum, he says, the methods of 1956 and 1968 will not work and should not be used. So he already said there will be no threat of force in the hierarchical Soviet system. If the General Secretary laid down that policy, it would be very difficult to challenge it. Again, he has to come back to it. In 1989, he gathers all the ambassadors to the socialist countries because those people were mainly still old conservative apparatchiks. He says to them, he orders them, do not impose anything on anybody. Every country is very specific. Considering that specificity, we're not playing with them. We reject force in everything, in all our policies. That's the internal meeting. Now, when you look at all this, of course, what is Gorbachev's vision? What do they really want to achieve? Yes, they want to reinvigorate socialism in their own country. Their priorities are domestic, but for that they have to end the Cold War. And the only road they see to modernize Russia, it's so clear, the only solution to Russia's long economic problems, and the economy is now crumbling by 1989, they see integration into Europe as the only answer. Well, if you want to integrate into Europe, you can't use force in Europe. The idea is this common European home, that you allow gradual reform in East European countries. You allow and encourage East Europeans to integrate with the West. You look at them as test cases, as models of what will happen with the Soviet Union. And then, almost through them, you would also integrate into Europe in this common European home, which would be built on universal human values. There will be no use of force for a resolution of disputes. There will be economic cooperation and integration and cooperation and collective security. That was his vision. And from here, I will just end with where this vision kind of ends. For me, in my own research, it was amazing to see that there is a certain moment after which they don't really talk about common European home. But in 1989, they talk all European process, European security structures, common European home. That is the main priority. He comes again and again to that idea. And that idea includes transformation of both NATO and the Warsaw Pact into political blocs, strengthening CSC and then OSCE structures, and at some point in the future, withering away of the blocs. A very naive vision, but very strongly integrative vision based on human rights. However, then, what happens is that the Berlin Wall collapses, and German unification proceeds with such a fast pace. It still fits. That's why the Soviets don't take any action against it. That's why they speak very positively against unification. But they see unification within this building of the common European home. Okay, so what, in the middle of this common European home will be united Germany. There's no reason to oppose it. So there's revolution in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, Poland has free elections. So we also had multiple candidate elections. It's all good as long as it leads to common European home. But the pace of German unification overtakes the possibility of building common European home the way they wanted, because the attention shifts to Germany, the attention shifts away from common European structures that Gorbachev was thinking about. And along this process, East European countries understand that force will not be used. The question is when and where and whom. And I think Csaba created a great argument there that even though the leaders understood early on, they floated the Brezhnev doctrine to their population. So I think that is completely supported in the Soviet documents and the East European documents that we have. So by the time Germany unites fast, the Soviets understand there will be no common European home. Or it will be, but as Cherняev says, we will not have an apartment in it. They realize it. That's already in January 1990. He says, there will be a common European home, but we probably will not have an apartment. And they accept unification of Germany in NATO. And I will just add with this quote that shows to you how radical, really, their visions were. Cherняev says in May 1990, regarding the discussions about the fact that as a result of German unification and the possible entry of Poland into NATO, the borders of the bloc would move to the Soviet frontier. This argument is from yesterday. This is a strategy from World War II and the Cold War, when our own security was measured not only in the military sphere, but in the social and political spheres throughout the socialist Commonwealth. Our real security is now being determined at the Soviet-American arms control negotiations. Complete redefinition of security. Now, Tom ended with missed opportunities. And the biggest missed opportunity probably is the slowing down and almost disappearance of arms control negotiations, especially under the Bush and Putin administrations. But there is another great missed opportunity there that when we have now is that Russia is not only not integrated into Europe, into the West, but is rewriting its past, rewriting the end of the Cold War, and arguing that Russia now has a very special type of democracy, a managed democracy. And I think that as these debates go on this year with the anniversary of German unification, we will be able to contribute to those debates, and we will try to keep history straight, or at least contingent. Thank you.